Greetings, book lovers, and get ready for a literary adventure that will ignite your imagination. Join me as we traverse the captivating landscapes of Beloved by Toni Morrison. Chapter 1. Seth and her daughter Denver were the only living residents in the house on Bluestone Road called 124 near Cincinnati, Ohio. It was in 1873 when Sethi Semmes Howard and Bugler had run away. They were unable to deal with the destructive and bothersome ghost within the house. Not long after Howard and Bugler left home, Seth's mother-in-law, Baby Suggs, died. It was then that Seth, Denver, and the ghost, believed to be Seth's 2-year-old daughter, remained. House 124 was the house the neighbors knew to avoid. Returning from work, Seth arrived at 124 to find an old friend, Paul D., who sat waiting for her on the porch. Paul D. was one of the slave boys who lived at Sweet Home. There had been 5 slave boys when Seth was brought there. One was Hall Suggs, Seth's husband. It had been 18 years since Seth and Paul D. had seen each other. Enjoying their talk about old times, Seth invited Paul D. to stay the night. When Paul D. walked through the doorway of the house, he felt an overwhelming sadness. Seth felt an overwhelming sadness. Sethi explained it was the spirit of her dead baby daughter. Her sons eventually ran away from the haunting. Denver didn't like Paul D. being there to take her mother's attention. Seth shared her story of leaving Sweet Home, about being beaten by some of the school teacher's pupils, and about how they broke open her back and stole her milk. The cuts had left a scar that looked like a tree and left her with no feeling in her back. As Paul D. approached Seth, the ghost started shaking the floorboards. Paul yelled at it to leave. He threw the table, knocking things over and throwing what he could to fight off the ghost. Eventually, everything settled down. Seth and Paul D. left the kitchen in a mess and went upstairs to her bedroom. Chapter 2. After sleeping together, Seth and Paul D. laid in bed still and quiet. Paul D. remembered how he had yearned for Seth when they were at Sweet Home. Seth was the only girl, and all of the boys waited to find out which of them she would choose. It was Hall that Seth ended up with. They were together for 6 years, which was seen as a blessing since the men in their lives were usually killed, sold, taken away, or would run away. Hall was the father to all 4 of Seth's children. Hall was the one child Baby Suggs had the longest, 20 years. Hall gained his mother's freedom by being hired out on the weekends to pay for her release. Lying in bed next to Seth, Paul D. thought of how he had wanted to be with her 25 years ago, and he still felt she would be suitable for him. Seth felt in Paul's gentle glances something she hadn't felt since being with Hall. Chapter 3. Denver enjoyed hearing Seth's story of when she left Sweet Home. Seth's legs and feet were swollen, making walking nearly impossible. Her moaning was heard by a white girl walking through the area. The girl, Amy, told Seth of a shelter to go to rest. Denver described her vision of seeing a small dress to Seth. She wanted to know more of what had happened at Sweet Home aside from the beatings and running away while pregnant. Seth told her about the school teacher who ran the farm after Mr. Garner died. The talk went back to the baby in the white dress. They wondered if it was a sign for something to come. Seth reflected on her night with Paul D. She thought about how, for the first time in 18 years, she was able to feel. She wasn't just going through motions to get done. She started to think she might have a reason to look ahead and plan for her future. This was not a familiar concept for Seth. She wondered if being able to feel was something she could handle. Asking how Denver would react to Paul D. staying, Seth explained, Denver was a charmed child. Seth explained Denver had brought the white girl from afar to save her life when she was dying in the field after leaving Sweet Home. Seth started to give another example about Denver's charm when schoolteacher came for her. Paul D. questioned schoolteacher's arrival at 124, but Seth only said she chose to go to jail rather than go back to Sweet Home. Chapter 4. An argument between Seth and Paul D. about Denver sent a warning to Paul D. that Seth had developed a strong connection to Denver. He knew this was a risk, since slave women are not expected to love anyone deeply to avoid being hurt over and over when the person is gone. Paul D. said Denver will have to make room for him. He told Seth to feel safe with him. He told her he was there because of her, and he wanted to spend his life with her. Paul D. wanted to take Seth and Denver to the carnival, even though they were reluctant to go. Denver came to like Paul D. by the end of the day. She noticed when the three of them were together, she wasn't being stared at in the usual way, and people greeted her by name. Paul D. met some people in the community and received information on possible work. Chapter 5. Seth, Denver, and Paul D. returned home from the carnival to find a stranger sitting near the front of the house. Seth immediately left to go to the outhouse, responding to a strong urge to urinate upon seeing this person. The woman was well-dressed and very thirsty. She looked tired and undernourished. Her skin was very smooth. She told them her name was Beloved. Beloved did not understand the questions Paul D. asked about where she came from. He figured she was wandering away from her past life. Even though they wanted to know her situation, Paul D. and Seth knew not to push her for any information. Each colored had their unique story, which may or may not ever be told. Beloved was so tired, she fell asleep sitting up. She was offered the keeping room to stay in and immediately fell asleep in Baby Sug's bed. The sound of her breathing made Paul D. and Seth think she was ill. Beloved stayed in bed asleep for 4 days, only waking for water. Denver stayed with her, taking care of her every need. Denver spent all of her time with Beloved, hoping her to wake and feel better. Denver was so busy with Beloved, she stayed away from her hiding place in the field. Chapter 6. Beloved began to follow Seth and watching her every move. Beloved got up early as Seth prepared for work. Beloved watched for Seth to return home in the afternoon and began to walk to meet her. At one point, Beloved asked Seth about her diamond. Seth had never had a diamond and didn't know what Beloved meant. However, Seth remembered having crystal earrings before. Beloved wanted to know about the diamonds. Seth told them about how she had gotten the crystal earrings from Mrs. Garner when she and Hal got married. The usual practice of a slave marriage was seeking permission from the owner, and if agreed, they were considered married. Mrs. Garner picked out a pair of crystal earrings for Seth. She never wore the earrings until she got to 124 and Baby Suggs helped her pierce her ears. Seth continued telling stories about her mother, whom she had only seen a few times in her life. Seth had seen her mother hanged from a tree at a slave farm. The woman Nan, who had taken care of Seth as a child, told her the information she knew about her mother. Denver could not understand how Beloved knew things about her mother, such as the earrings. These were things Denver had never known about. Denver was relieved when Seth came out of her thoughts. Denver couldn't understand the questions Beloved had asked and wondered how she knew about the earrings. Chapter 7. Paul D. noticed Beloved shining. He sensed her arousal. Beloved didn't pay attention to him or engage in conversation with him, so he knew her desires weren't directed toward him. Paul D. had no say in Beloved leaving because it was C's house, but he tried to understand her purpose for being there. At dinner one night, Paul D. began to ask Beloved direct questions about her people. where she came from, where she was heading, and how she got there. Beloved said she had no family, and she was looking for this house. Paul D. questioned the clothes and shoes she had on when she arrived. She told him he had taken them from someone. Seth and Paul D. spoke again about Sweet Home. Seth told Paul D. that Hal had left her. Paul D., in defending Hal, ended up sharing information about the night the boys took Seth's milk. Paul D. said Hal was in the loft and saw what had happened to her. Seth couldn't understand why, if Hal had been there and saw what those boys did to her, that he did not help her. The shock had broken Hal that night. He would never be the same after seeing what had happened. Paul D. told Seth that the last time he saw Hal was at the butter churn. Hal had butter all over his face. Paul D. couldn't talk to him because of the steel bit in his mouth. Chapter 8. Denver sat on her bed watching Beloved dance. It was the first time she had seen Beloved happy. Denver started dancing with her. They broke down laughing, leaving them breathless. Denver wanted to know why Beloved chose that name and what it was like where she came from. Denver continued the story of when she was born in the boat. Denver recited the story she knew. Denver described Amy to Beloved as a girl with long arms, strong hands, and a lot of hair on her head, who talked a lot. Denver told her how Amy knew Seth had to move down off of the hill because anyone could be after her. When they reached the water, they found a boat. It was the boat where the baby would be born. Amy told Seth not to forget she was the girl who took care of her and delivered her baby, Amy Denver from Boston. Seth liked her name Denver. She thought it was a pretty name. Chapter 9. It had been 9 years since Baby Suggs died. Seth wanted to go to the clearing to be near her. The clearing was a place in the woods where the Collards came to be with Baby Suggs. They listened as she prayed, and together they would dance, laugh, and cry. In the clearing, Seth sat on the rock where Baby Suggs used to preach. Seth remembered how lively the place had once been. The people she met had taught her how to be a person out of slavery. Sitting there, she began to feel fingers rubbing her neck. Gently, she relaxed, thinking of Baby Suggs caring for her from another place. The hands on her neck were getting tighter and gripping her under her chin. Seth could no longer breathe. Denver ran to her and pulled the invisible hands from Seth. Seth knew those hands belonged to the ghost Paul D. had sent away. Paul D. was bathing in the tub under the stairs when she to him, and he stood and embraced her. Seth was aware she could handle how things had turned out between the two of them. Beloved ran out when she saw Paul D. and Seth together. Beloved wanted Seth to herself. Denver remembered what Nelson Lord had asked her at Lady Jones's house. Denver thought if it was true, then she understood why her brothers went away. She began to focus on the baby ghost, which before she hadn't paid much attention to. Chapter 10. The schoolteacher at the Garner farm had sold Paul D. to Brandywine, who Paul D. tried to kill, which ended him in prison in Alfred, Georgia. Paul D. was chained to 45 other prisoners and forced into a wooden box buried 5 feet deep into a ditch. The 5-foot-wide box had locked bars on one side. The first man on the chain was called the High Man. He led the way into the woods, where each prisoner took a sledgehammer and went to work. In the prison, Paul D. saw his life as dead until the rain started. They worked in the rain for 9 days until it wasn't possible to do anything more in the mud. They chained the men together and locked them in the boxes. The water began rising into the box when Paul D. felt the pull of the chain so hard that it pulled him down. He knew what it was. He pulled on the chain to the other side of him, continuing the message. The ditch in front of the bars on the box was caving in. He felt the tug of the chain from the other direction, and each man knew what to do, even though no one spoke a word. One man at a time dove into the mud and under the bars of the box. Each man helped the other to safety. They knew if one man went down, they all would go down. All 46 men were free. Chapter 11. Paul D. found himself not sleeping in bed with Steve. He slept in the rocking chair until, feeling unsettled, he moved into Baby Sug's bed. From there, he went to the storage room and finally outside in the shed. Even though they were not sharing the same bed, Paul D. and Seth continued to have sex every day. Paul D.'s sleeping arrangements were something he did automatically. He would feel uneasy and go in search of another place. One night in the shed, as he tried to settle in, someone walked in, and without seeing who it was, he asked what the person wanted. The answer came from Beloved. She told him she wanted him to touch her inside and say her name. Paul D. told Beloved how good Seth had been to her and that she was loved like a daughter. Beloved told Paul D. that Seth was the only person she loved, which made Paul ask why she was there with him. He told her to return to the house, but she insisted he touch her inside. She wanted him to call out her name. Paul D. kept his back to her. He wanted the sin to stay behind him. He finally said Beloved because she kept repeating the request. She walked closer. He wasn't aware of her movement. He also didn't realize that the rusted can in his chest could be a red heart. He continued to repeat the words "red heart" louder and louder until Denver woke up. Chapter 12. Seth tried seeking answers from Beloved. Seth thinks Beloved's life was so damaging that she can't remember anything. Denver is convinced Beloved was the dress she saw through the window holding seeds as she prayed. Denver kept her eyes on Beloved, always watching everything about her. Denver and Beloved went to the cold house for cider. It was bright outside but dark inside the shed. When Beloved didn't respond to Denver's calling, she pleaded with Beloved not to go back. Beloved appeared and told Denver she didn't want that place. Beloved pointed to a ray of sunshine coming through the ceiling of the shed. She told Denver to look at it, but Denver didn't see anything. Beloved curled her body and rocked and moaned quietly and said, "Over there," her face. Denver asked who she is talking about, and she said, "Me, it's me." Chapter 13. Paul D. met Seth after work one day to tell her what he had been doing with Beloved for the past weeks. Beloved went into the cold house at night for sex. He felt the need to tell Seth what had happened, but instead, he told her he wanted her to get pregnant. Paul D. wasn't sure where the idea came from, but if it were to happen, he thought it would help him break out of the spell he was caught in with Beloved. Paul D. and Seth flirted as they walked home in the cold wind. When the snow started coming harder, Paul D. lifted Seth onto his back and ran. She slid down and told him he needed babies to play in the snow. They reached the point where Beloved meets Seth every day. Beloved was there with no warm clothes. Seth put the shawl on Beloved and held her to shelter her from the cold. Paul D. walked behind them, holding his anger to himself. Seth thought about what it would mean for her if she were to get pregnant. She didn't think she could provide everything a new baby requires, including being cared for. Seth agreed she had all of the kids she wanted. Seth recalled when she first saw the dress and shoes sitting on the stump in front of 124 and thought about how her bladder was immediately full and she broke water even before seeing the face of the person. Chapter 14. Beloved and Denver were in the kitchen after Seth and Paul D. went upstairs to bed. Beloved told Denver to make him leave. Denver knew Seth would be mad if he left. Beloved had her fingers in her mouth and pulled a tooth out from the back of her mouth, then pulled a tooth out from the back of her mouth. Beloved began to think her body was starting to fall apart. She had difficulty keeping her head on and her arms and legs together, but with her tooth coming out, she feared she was going to fall apart. Chapter 15. Stamp took 2 buckets to the riverside and returned hours later with snagged clothes, scratches, and 2 buckets full of blackberries for baby Suggs to make pies. The plan was to make 2 pies, but the berries were enough for many more. Neighbors were invited for pie and chicken and fish, turning the evening into a banquet for all 90 people who came to eat. Baby Suggs got a sense the next morning. People were upset that Baby Suggs was always the focus. They thought she always knew what was needed, had the answers, and helped the sick. Most of all, she loves. Baby Suggs smelled a worse odor, bringing a bad feeling. Baby Suggs thought about her arrival to Cincinnati as a free woman. She realized her hands were her own and felt her heartbeat inside her chest. She laughed at these new sensations. Baby Suggs was fascinated by Cincinnati. Mr. Garner introduced her to the Bodwins, who allowed Baby Suggs to live in one of their homes in exchange for fixing shoes, doing laundry, and sewing. The house they gave her was a big house outside of town. Chapter 16. 4 men arrived at the house on horses: the schoolteacher, his nephew, the sheriff, and a slave catcher. These men were there to return a slave who had run away. The nephew motioned to the others that the people from the house were around the back. That is where they found an old colored man standing on the woodpile with an axe and Baby Suggs in the garden. Their look toward the shed signaled to the men to look in there. When the shed door was open, they found a colored woman sitting on the ground holding a young child covered in blood and swinging a baby by the feet, trying to hit the baby's head on the wall of the shed. 2 bleeding boys lay in a pile of sawdust. Stamp ran into the shed and grabbed the baby before it made contact with the wall. The sheriff stared at Seth, who sat holding tight to her dead baby. One of the boys stirred on the ground and the sheriff directed her to go with him. Baby Suggs walked in the sheriff behind the sheriff and gathered up the boys who she saw were alive. Seth would not let go of the dead baby in her arms, even though Stamp had tried to take it from her. He still held on to Denver. The sheriff left to get a cart to haul Seth away. Inside the house, Baby Suggs cared for the boy's injuries. She then took the dead baby into the keeping room and gave Denver to Seth to nurse. Baby Suggs and C fought over the fact that Sadie did not clean the blood off of her breast before feeding the baby. Baby Suggs fell to the floor and Seth started feeding Denver from her bloody breast. The blood mixed in with the milk. The sheriff returned to the house with the cart. Seth came out with Denver clung to her chest. A crowd of colored people gathered as Stamp drove her away. Not a sound was heard. Baby Suggs tried to stop C from taking the baby with her, but by the time she got up and out the door, they were gone. Her thoughts were interrupted by 2 white children who had brought a pair of shoes for her to repair. Chapter 17. Stamp paid and Paul D. worked together at the slaughterhouse. Stamp showed Paul D. the newspaper clipping with the picture of Seth on it. Seeing it for the first time, Paul D. refused to believe it was Seth in the picture. He was sure the lips in the picture were not Seth's lips. Stamp wanted Paul D. to know the story behind the picture. He read the article with the picture and still refused to believe it was Seth in the picture. Stamp planned to tell Paul D. about Baby Suggs' feeling that morning when she was in the garden. He knew she sensed something and they kept a watch on the road just in case. Stamp thought about how no one gave a warning, no one spoke up to defend one of their own. Stamp felt it had something to do with the people's perception of Baby Suggs. He thought maybe the people were somehow testing Baby Suggs' holiness, seeing if she had some type of power which no one else had. Stamp also decided not to tell Paul D about how Seth grabbed up her children and went into the shed. Stamp knew the shed was empty because they used all of the wood the night before. Paul D reminded Stamp he had known Seth for a long time, since they were young. He could assure her the lips on the picture were not hers. Stamp didn't tell the rest of the story. The message he received from Paul D made him question his own knowledge of the event, but Stamp was certain of what took place 18 years ago when a runaway from slavery tried to kill her children in hopes of saving them from having to grow up as she had. Chapter 18. Seth spoke about her kids. She mentioned how the little girl was already crawling when she arrived at the house. She thought about the week before the kids left. The girl was only rolling over and sitting on her own. Seth had wanted to know more about raising children, but it was only herself and Mrs. Garner, and Mrs. Garner and Mrs. Garner never had children. Seth tried to use what she could remember from the women at the other farms. Seth spoke of how difficult it was on her own. Hall helped when he could between his debt. Work. She remembered a time when Sixo helped Howard when he had hurt his thumb. She was grateful for the help Sixo had offered her. Paul D waited for Seth to give him information about the picture from the newspaper he had shown her. He had thought that she would see it and start laughing, and they would both get a good laugh out of it. As soon as Seth saw the picture, Paul D knew from her reaction that it wasn't a joke. Seeing the love in his eyes, Seth began to tell Paul D the story. She told him how she had gotten her kids and herself out of Kentucky. She spoke of the love she had for them, and how she was able to love them more once she arrived at Baby Suggs' house. Seth continued to speak, but the story didn't go directly to the answer Paul D waited to hear. Seth was aware of her avoidance of giving a straight response. She knew all she had to admit was how she saw the schoolteacher's hat and knew he was there after her and her children. Seth gathered up her kids and went into the shed. Her reaction to the moment was to do what was needed to keep her children from living the life she had as a slave. Her way of protecting them was to kill them. Seth told Paul D she wanted her babies to be safe. Paul D walked out the door, telling her he may be home too late to eat. Seth knew he wanted to tell her goodbye, but she thought he might not think she could handle those words. Chapter 19. Stamp Paid felt responsible for Paul D leaving 124. He walked past the house wanting to stop in. He wanted to find out if Seth blamed him for telling Paul D about her past. Seth remembered her first days at 124. Those were the best days in her life. She had women friends, her children, and Baby Suggs. There were conversations and people who cared. There were sessions in the clearing, singing, dancing, and friendship. Then there was that day after the party when her entire life changed. Many years of misery and agony led her to the day when she felt alive again, when Paul D entered but was easily wiped away when her past was revealed to him. Seth, Denver, and Beloved went out to the frozen pond to ice skate with the 3 skates they found. They tried to stay up while on the ice, but found themselves hitting the ice. They lay on their backs on the ground to take a break. Denver got up to try again on her one skate. Before she got far, she tripped falling forward, making them all burst out in laughter again. Seth picked herself up to her hands and knees and stayed that way laughing. Done laughing, she began to cry. The 3 headed back to the house, holding on to each other as they walked. Inside, Seth warmed milk, and with blankets and the fire of the cook stove, they were comfortable and warm. Seth heard Beloved humming a song which Seeth had made up and only sang to her children. Seth told Beloved about the secrecy of the song, but Beloved told her she knew the song. Seth knew who Beloved was at that moment. Seth woke in the morning, happy about what she discovered the night before. Seth saw Beloved in a new way, glad that Beloved wasn't angry at her as she had thought. Seth saw the possibility of her boys coming back in the same way the little girl did. On her walk to work that morning, she went through her memories of being in the jail, going to the burial, and getting the stone engraved. Stamp approached the door and knocked. He saw two inside, but only knew one of them. No one visited 124. Stamp took his wonder to L.A. and John in hopes to find out what was happening. Stamp told Ella about the other girl he saw with Denver. Ella knew about every color that came to town, but this is one she didn't know. Ella told Stamp where to find Paul D. Seth was late for work that morning and Sawyer started in on her. He threatened her to be on time or he would get rid of her. In a hurry to get back home, Seth thought about sweet home. She wanted to tell the little girl about the events of their lives. Seth was happy to have gotten her boys and the girl out of there. Chapter 20. Seth reflected on and rehearsed what she wanted to tell Beloved about her history. Seth was happy. Beloved had come back to her, and she wanted to make sure she did the best for her. She would explain everything to Beloved, how she had to kill her so she wouldn't have to die from those who were going to take her. Seth would describe her love for her children and her justification in her actions. Seth wanted to explain the situations she had to live through and did not want any of that to happen to her children. Seth's happiness brought light and color to the things she saw. She could see things with a different point of view. Seth started to plan what she wanted to teach. Beloved, there was new hope for her life. Her daughter had come back to her. Chapter 21. It was the sound of Beloved going up the stairs that returned Denver's hearing after losing it when Seth was going to answer the question about killing her sister. Beloved had always been with Denver in the house. Beloved was there with Denver to wait for her daddy to come home. Denver's brothers had left the house because they knew what their mother had done and wanted her dead. They taught Denver how to kill their mother if it came to it. They told her they were leaving to go to the war. On the nights her mother would come to braid her hair, Denver was afraid and imagined that her head would get cut off and taken away to be braided. Denver felt the only safe room was with Grandma Baby. She knew her mother wouldn't get her in that room. It was those nights with Grandma Baby when Denver would dream of her daddy coming home. She and Grandma Baby believed he would come back. She told Denver all about him. Grandma Baby believed the ghost was looking for love, but that it was going after her and Seth because of how she had died. Denver had a lot of love for Beloved. Beloved was hers. Chapter 22. Beloved lived among the dead. She was pulled back into the living world. In that world, there were men without skin, a dead man's face on hers. She said they try to get out of their bodies. She described the dead bodies that were left by the ones able to die. More are pushed through, but Beloved is still there. Beloved came out of the water, no longer dead, and goes to the house where she heard the woman whisper. Beloved notices it is Seth's face, her smile that smiles at Beloved. They are together. Chapter 23. Seth and Beloved answer the questions they both long to know. Denver commits to protecting Beloved and warns her of the things to be careful of. A promise is made to not leave each other ever again. They are connected through the water, blood, and milk. There are things Beloved wants to know about Seth. She wants to know why Seth went into the water and went near Beloved without smiling at her. Now that Beloved is at the house, Seth told her that she sees her smile. Beloved will hold on to Seth this time. Chapter 24. Paul D. was sitting outside on the church porch keeping warm with a bottle of alcohol. He felt that his heart, which he refers to as his tin box, has been opened and was leaking, leaving him open to being targeted by others. His reflections of his torn-apart family and other families who were kept together by the same slave owner made him wonder why he hadn't given up on living like Sixo did at Sweet Home. Paul D. went back over the plan which had taken him from Sweet Home to the porch of the church, sat on. The white men caught up with Sixo and Paul D. with their guns straight on them. When they tied Paul D. to a tree, schoolteacher yelled out to keep him alive. Sixo had fought with the white man, eventually ending up knocked out. When Sixo woke up, tied to a tree, he laughed and sang loudly, and the schoolteacher gave the directive to kill Sixo, thinking he wasn't right in the head. Before Sixo finished his song, the men shot and killed him. Seth visited Paul D. in his cabin. She had taken her children to the corn to leave with the others. She was looking for Hallie. Paul D. told her about Sixo being killed and that he didn't know where Paul A. or Hall was. Seth told him she was leaving, which he didn't think she would make it far being as pregnant as she was. Paul D. said goodbye, knowing that would be the last time he would see her. Chapter 25. Stamp paid Cain to see Paul D. at the church. Stamp wanted to make sure things were all right between the two of them. Stamp told Paul D. his story about changing his name from Joshua and about his wife and the master's son. Stamp had something else to tell Paul D. even though Paul D. was growing angry with him. Stamp said he was there when Seth killed her daughter. He said Seth wanted to hurt the herder. Stamp confirmed Seth's love for her children. Instead of fearing Seth, Paul D. said he feared the girl staying at 124. Stamp let Paul D. know that he had seen her there and wanted to know who she was, and Paul D. did not know the answer. Chapter 26. Seth began to tend to Beloved's every need and command, being run ragged by whatever Beloved wanted. Denver watched all of this happen. And instead of fearing Seth and wanting to protect Beloved, she now saw the need to take care of Seth. Seth continued to be late for work and eventually lost her job. Their food supply was running out, and Seth began to show signs of illness because she gave up everything for Beloved. Inside 124, it was hard on Denver as she had to take care of everything for Seth and Beloved. Seth was trying to make things up to Beloved for what she did to her, and Beloved was making Seth pay for doing it. Denver went to find work at the Bodwins. Janie Wagon worked for Mr. and Miss Bodwin and knew that Denver was related to Baby Suggs when she first met her at the door. She wanted to know what was wrong with Seth, and Denver thought that she should tell the whole story to better her chances of getting work. After Janie learned of Denver's story, word got out all over the area of about Seth's dead daughter being alive. The story spread about Seth being attacked by this daughter who was back from the dead. Denver waited on the porch for Mr. Bodwin to pick her up for her overnight job. She watched one way for him while coming from the other direction was a group of women led by L.A. heading towards 124 to rescue Seth. The women all pictured themselves when they were younger, playing and eating during those days when the house was alive with companionship. The woman fell to their knees and began praying. Ella understood Seth's passion for protection. Seth and Beloved heard the noise outside. Seeing the women gathered and singing reminded Seth of being in the clearing. They walk out on the porch. Beloved was naked, and Seeth held the ice pick she was using to chip the ice to keep Beloved cool inside. Mr. Bodwin pulled up to the house, and Seth saw his white face. She knew he was coming to take one of her children. Seth ran off toward him, Denver chasing behind. Beloved stood on the porch, smiling. She saw the man without skin looking at her. Chapter 27. Stamp and Paul D. share what they heard about what had happened in front of 124. Stamp said her hard that Verba.Vividus plans to sell the house. Paul D. asked if that is the guy side tried to stab. Janie told Stamp Mr. Bodwin was trying to figure out who the naked lady on the porch was, and they didn't think he saw Seth coming at him. Stamp said Ella and Denver jumped on Seth before she could get to him and knocked her down. Ella punched Seth in the mouth, and Denver got the ice pick out of her hand. No one was sure what had happened to Beloved. Someone said she exploded. Some said she exploded. Some said she disintegrated, and Ella feared she was still around. Both men began to laugh, thinking about how crazy Seth is. They wondered why she felt like she had to kill someone every time a white man came into the yard. They kept laughing and coming up with other scenarios of future encounters with whites in the neighborhood. Paul D. saw Denver one morning after she left work at the Bowdens. They spoke about how things were going since Beloved was gone. Denver said Seth was not good. He decided to go see Seed. Looking at her, Paul D. remembered what 60 had told him about his 30-mile woman. 60 had said his woman gathered him up. She was a friend of his mind. This is how Paul D. saw Seeds. He told her of the many tomorrows they had to live, and she was the only one who was her best. Chapter 28. The final chapter presents the portrayal of a girl who, although anonymous to many, was most powerful to those within her closest reach. The memory of the events of Beloved will not remain with anyone, nor will her story ever be shared.